An article was recommended to me by Nick Schaferhoff from Google. Had a bunch of example layouts from different popular websites that you could use in your own designs. And it got me thinking, can we build these in PowerApps? Let me show you how.
Starting into this first one, we have the Nvidia site. See, it has this Z design pattern that they've called out here. Now, the majority of this, I think you guys are already going to recognize how you could execute on it in the Power Apps scenario. Like the majority of these are already buttons or icons. That's the easy stuff. For this gallery, this carousel they have, what you're going to want to do is you're going to approach it as a horizontal gallery where you've set your width, both of the entire gallery control, but also of the template as the full size of the app. And then you're hiding your various scroll bar and navigation options. And then what you're going to do is on top of that, you're you're adding another gallery that actually sits on top. And this is where you get some really slick utilization. And there are other ways you could achieve this, but I think the one that's easiest to wrap your brain around is the second horizontal gallery. And for those same records you're feeding in, which now will scale dynamically to the data you feed in, right? You're representing these either these images or icons, or perhaps you're using the HTML text to render a vector that then you color dynamically. There's a lot of different ways you could recreate that dot, and then you'll match using a variable in between. You can match the slide that is showing on the screen to the other gallery that is sitting on top of it that represents its progress. And really, I would just approach those probably as like styled buttons or apply transparent buttons over on top, always an option. That way, when you click on them, you can set the you can set to a specific ID that you want to be the default display of the other gallery behind you, which then, right, you feed that to a variable. The variable feeds that default value of that horizontal gallery control. You reset that carousel gallery control, which is going to cause it to reload to default. Then it's showing the page that the user is selected. Probably the easiest way to get it to scroll through automatically is to also affect that default value and trigger reloads, and just do that through a hidden timer in the background, that continues to loop, and that you have some sort of logic. Once you reach a value that's going to be equal to or greater than the last ID, that then you reset back to 0 or 1. Moving on to the next one, Netflix. Now, I hope that is jumping out to you when you see this. This is content that's going to be larger and longer than the content of any of the user screens that are mostly dealing with it. Let's just have somebody with a ultra wide that's turned on its side. So what you're going to do immediately is think to yourself, this whole thing is contained in a vertical container, because you need the vertical container to be able to fit more stacked content than what page width will allow. And then you can create that kind of scrolling experience by constricting the content. You can match it to the width of the app, and then you'll see once you start to explore it further, right, you're going to nest more contents inside of it that then take on the width of the parent container. So the parent container takes on the width of the app, which means that will scale dynamically based on if you've allowed fixed or variable widths and heights of it. That container will inherit it, and then your child containers can also inherit that for width. And then you can make a decision on whether you're going to do fixed height containers for style purposes, or if you're going to allow it to flex to the content inside, right? That's going to give you the greatest flexibility if you're just designing kind of like a fixed content experience. However, let's say you're actually doing something off of data. You could accomplish this with a vertical gallery after this initial kind of search experience they have up at the top by putting in right? Even your standard vertical gallery, these look pretty much the same height to me looking at it. Although you could accomplish it with a flexible gallery if that was your user need. And then what you could do is for the control properties inside, because right, what we're really looking at here is two text controls and an image control that are simply alternating uh, their position and their order in each of these containers. What you could do is, as long as they're within a gallery control, you could manipulate the X properties based on something like if the record is even or odd, which would cause it to alternate, and then you can have them flip and dynamically based on the order they receive. Now, if you're filtering this in a very specific way, where you're going to get sequential even or odd ID records, that's going to break things. That's where things get a little bit tricky. You could address that on the front end when you load the data into a collection by adding some sort of counting variable on the front, or just arbitrarily, jumping between even or odds and then using that as the variable to dynamically adjust this. Like there are ways to account for it. It depends a little bit on the data structure and the requirements there, but know that this is possible. Right? Let's move on to a big one, right? The New York Times, a print layout, a layout that inherits many substructures from print. When you actually look at it, it's just containers nested in containers nested in containers. And then there's actually, you can accomplish this with several galleries. So again, right, very long content. There's a lot of height to it. So you're dealing with a container there. However, this one, this screenshot doesn't necessarily imply that there's a large vertical container, but of course you could nest this all in a vertical container. I'm seeing two clear columns here. So my initial instinct to recreate this kind of layout is to start with a parent horizontal container, and then you're going to nest two vertical containers inside of it. And then if you're adjusting this dynamically based on the viewport or the device width of the person looking at it, now that parent horizontal container, you can adjust wrap size, and that side column can get wrapped underneath. And in that secondary vertical container with that side column, you can dynamically adjust, like, hey, once you get to this constricted width, looking at apped out width, like now you can start taking up the whole width as opposed to a percentage of the parent that we're originally dealing with here. You got to know if that's going to be a scenario that comes into play when you're dealing with mobile experiences, stuff that's like sub 500 pixel widths. Things can get kind of tricky to make this work with this particular type of layout. My instinct is almost to approach it in an old school way and handle that development separately because the mobile experience is such a fixed width experience, such a narrow width experience. It's almost like just start from the ground up because they need radically different needs. But let's break this into chunks and talk about how you can approach this because it seems intimidating on the front to build a print type layout like this. And like, where would you even be able to pull in data to accomplish it in this way? But let's look at some of these individual pieces, right? This headline piece up at the top, still dealing with basic content here, still dealing with standard control, but right, still text controls and an image control, stuff we work with every day when we're building PowerApps. The only question is how are we going to pick a record? How are we going to populate this in a dynamic way that would change over time? And really, that's just about thinking about how am I going to isolate the individual record that I want to use to populate this. We're just thinking about filter criteria and or your data design when you're a step before building the application, making sure that you have appropriate indicators that you can reference in the application upon data load to indicate like this is a prominent element that's going to go. I'm going to load the latest record. I'm going to load the first record. I'm going to load the only record that is in this. I'm going to use that individual record to populate these fields. Moving a little bit further down, this is another interesting layout, right? We have another horizontal gallery, but they've done two more nested vertical galleries. Once you start nesting containers inside of each other, you'll start to see that a lot of the designs you see out there are just nested containers inside containers. Uh, no surprise from anyone who comes from the old school dev world, uh, that it's all boxes all the way down. But if you're kind of a citizen developer and you're new to this, let this kind of open your eyes, breaking designs down that you see out in the world into these smaller pieces. They're really just boxes nested inside of each other. And and horizontal your vertical and horizontal containers, it's a mistake to say gallery, though you could accomplish that, are huge building blocks in accomplishing a bunch of these to get appropriate layout. Right, focusing over here, this is a really neat utilization here. Another kind of carousel within the experience, and what you can do is you can overlay a text control over an image, and then you can just adjust what feeds that image based on another gallery that's in the page. Because those little dots at the bottom, really, that's just representing individual records again. And then you can use the on select or other criteria to specify the one that is selected or intended, and then from filtering down to getting that individual record, get its individual property of the image, whether the image file or the URL, and feed that into your image control. Now, what I like about this, what could be really slick, is the way that this is executed, similar to what we're looking at the Nvidia page, right? It's still a standard horizontal gallery. It's just scaled very small, and none of the controls are representing anything other than there is a record there. And then we're doing some styling to represent this as dots. Looking at this, my initial instinct being I would use some sort of graphic or SVG, which then I could apply transparency to if the on select was not true. And then that way, as it scales through, right, apply like 50% transparency or something. That's going to work across multiple kind of color schemes. You could, of course, invert it, but when you're inverting it, then it's about right. You want to use another color that's going to pop out against the background. But I think transparency would be the easiest way to accomplish this kind of effect. And then you're making sure there's no transparency on the record that is selected. And then these buttons, what you can do is have a variable that holds a number value that lines up with the ID of the record. And then all you're doing is iterating through it. So you press the right button, it adds 1 to your record ID variable, so it goes to 2. And then now record 2 is the one that's selected. So the gallery adjusts to match the ID record of the variable, which then changes the input to the image field, and the whole thing adjusts. And the other nice way you can accomplish this is you can look at the total number and the first record to identify a start and end number of those ID variables, and you use those as criteria to disable your buttons. So then you're not pushing it past an available record value and break it yourself. And you can do a similar approach to get it to autoplay with a timer that's repeating, that then is iterating and adding to that ID variable function, which is feeding into the selection in the gallery, which is triggering the image to receive the selected record's image or URL. And then, right, you're playing through it. And then at the end, you have some sort of logic to make sure you don't go over your total record count, and you go back to the beginning, whether that's 0 or 1. Let's jump down to this one. Right, it looks more complicated than it is, but really, it's just right. We're looking at another opportunity for a horizontal gallery. There's really just 4 records, right? There's some details about it. You could accomplish this with some really small images, or I think actually this would be a really good opportunity for an HTML text control, because you're trying to kind of scale things down, and there's a lot of use of like little icons and stuff in conditional values. This would be something that I would if you don't have experience writing HTML, especially conditional HTML when you're kind of composing it based on record values, Copilot could be a great tool to use to execute on this. Otherwise, if you're more comfortable with the native controls, right, you're just talking about, some small controls placed closely together. Thankfully, right, like there's only 4 records that ever display in this. This isn't an experience that was really meant to scale. So you can use fixed widths here. You can use fixed width on the template. Make sure that you're filtering your data source to only allow 4 records. If there's the potential that you could ever get more or less, it's important to account for that when using a gallery control in a layout like this. But again, very doable once you break it into its individual pieces. The thing that I think actually has a lot of bang for its buck is this opinions column here on the right, which looks very slick and professional, but actually is a pretty simple layout once you break it into its pieces, especially a great opportunity for a flexible height gallery. So you you evaluate it like, oh, like these are individual records, they're stacked one on top of each other. Like this is definitely a gallery. And the thing that really, did it for me is once I started evaluating the items that were in the individual records of the design, like, oh, well, these are text controls. And then that little circle instantly makes me think of people columns on SharePoint lists, and using the Office 365 data connector in PowerApps. Great way to look up the user's profile image if they've uploaded it to Azure Active Directory, which I think is now called Entra ID. So if you need to pull in user profiles, I love to grab that connector. If there's the person column, I believe that it does give access to a profile image, but I am a little bit rusty on that. My default is always to just grab that Office 365 if I'm going to be dealing with any sort of people or representing people, and being able to pull in that image file and put a little face to the name in there. You can see in that second record, right? There's no person, but there's an image. Perfect kind of scenario to adjust the display based on the contents of the record, if content exists or not, because that image control could be on every one, but doesn't display if the value is blank or empty. So what that means is the way you kind of structure this is, hey, if the image column or that image control is populated, like feed into this, auto, width equals parent dot width, height is auto, and then, hide your person column that would normally display. And you see they kind of manipulated the available width for the title. So you can do kind of some conditional logic there about formatting and adjustment that works really well in that flexible height scenario. So it can look like it's a much more complicated layout than it is, just accounting for the different types of data and arrangements of data that can come through.
If you like this kind of thing, like this post, comment on it, send me a connect request, and also check me out on YouTube. See you next time.